ready to explore Plato's Republic.
One of the most influential works in philosophy ever.
It really is. In this deep dive, we'll be using your YouTube audiobook transcript to uncover some fascinating details.
Yeah, this one's full of debate. Plato doesn't hold back.
He really doesn't. We're going to be tackling some big questions about justice, virtue, and what makes an ideal society.
Oh, and how could we forget what it truly means to be a philosopher?
Exactly. Right from the beginning, we're thrown into this lively conversation. Socrates, Plato's main guy, is on his way back to Athens.
But does he make it?
Not quite. Polemarchus, who we'll talk about more later, basically intercepts him.
Insists that Socrates joins him and his friends for some, well, deep philosophical discussion.
I mean, could you imagine saying no to a philosophical debate in ancient Greece?
I don't think so. And the location is important. They're not just, like, hanging out at the Agora.
Right. It's the home of Cephalus.
A wealthy, older Athenian.
And this isn't just a casual get-together.
No, the group includes some pretty prominent Athenians, like Glaucon and Adeimantus, who really shake things up later in the Republic.
Oh yeah, they bring the heat. This gathering brings the concepts of justice and virtue to life.
Shows how these ideas play out among, the people who actually shape Athenian society.
Exactly. And Cephalus's house brings up the themes of wealth and age.
Themes that are central to how they initially define justice.
Right. Cephalus kicks off the whole discussion by talking about how wealth, especially as you get older, brings peace of mind.
He even suggests that it can help you avoid doing wrong.
Because you aren't tempted to cheat the system, right?
Exactly. You're not desperate. You're not cutting corners.
But could that peace of mind just be because of Cephalus's character?
Socrates seems to think so. He suggests that maybe Cephalus is just a naturally good person.
So is it really wealth, or is it something inside of us, true justice?
That's the question, isn't it? But instead of, getting defensive, Cephalus passes the argument to his son.
Polemarchus.
This shift from one generation to the next, it adds another layer to everything.
Like we're going from the wisdom of experience to the idealism of youth.
Yeah, something like that. And Polemarchus jumps right into a definition of justice, giving each person what they're owed.
Which to him means being good to your friends and harming your enemies. Pretty straightforward, right?
At first glance, yeah. It fits with ancient Greece's ideas of loyalty and reciprocity.
But we know Socrates can't let a simple definition just slide.
Of course not. And Socrates is like, hold on. How do you even know who your true friends are?
And is it ever really just to harm anyone, even an enemy?
He's got a way of making you question everything you thought you knew.
I know. It's like he pulls on one thread and the whole concept of justice unravels.
And just when the conversation's getting good, Thrasymachus, a well-known sophist, bursts onto the scene.
Talk about an entrance.
Yeah.
He drops this bomb by saying that justice is really just whatever those in power say it is.
The advantage of the stronger, as he puts it.
So it's all about power. Forget ethics.
That's the argument he's making. It's this cynical view that challenges everything Socrates believes in.
But Socrates doesn't back down, does he?
Not a chance.
Mm-hmm.
He starts using analogies to counter Thrasymachus.
Like by comparing rulers to different professions, doctors and ship captains?
He says a good ruler, just like a skilled doctor, should be using their knowledge and authority to serve the needs of the people.
Not for their own benefit, but for everyone else's.
Right. He's saying a healthy society needs all parts working together for the good of the whole. Like how a healthy body needs every organ to function.
So this is where Socrates starts to set up his vision of the ideal city, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, the debate isn't over yet.
Nope. Glaucon and Adeimantus have been listening to this whole thing, and they're about to step in.
They're not necessarily convinced by Thrasymachus, but they want Socrates to really prove his point.
They basically say, okay, Socrates, show us why being just is better, even if no one would ever know.
And to make their point, they bring up this really famous thought experiment, the Ring of Gyges.
Oh, I've heard of this. It's the one where the shepherd finds a ring, right?
And it makes him invisible.
And of course, he uses it to do a bunch of unjust stuff. It's like a superhero story, but backwards.
It really makes you think, would you still choose to be? Just even if you knew you could get away with anything?
Yeah, are we good because we want to be, or because we're scared of getting caught? This is where it gets really interesting.
Because to answer this challenge, Socrates starts to build his ideal city.
This is the Callipolis we hear about.
Yeah, it's like a thought experiment where you can test out his ideas.
And one of the first things he establishes is specialization. Everyone has a role that plays to their strengths.
Right. Like you're a blacksmith if you're good with metal, a farmer if you're good with crops, that kind of thing.
And then there's this whole guardian class, right?
The protectors of the city,
Mm.
but they aren't just soldiers,
They're carefully selected, given rigorous training,
both physical and mental.
and they're supposed to love truth, be super wise.
Socrates has high standards. And their education super specific too. They're taught stories that'll instill virtue and, make them ideal guardians.
It's fascinating, but then things get a bit tricky, right? Because Socrates introduces this idea of the noble lie.
Yeah. Basically, he says there should be this fictional story told to everyone in the city about their origins and their roles.
Wait, a lie? I thought Socrates was all about truth.
It is a bit strange.
Right.
But his argument is that this lie would make everyone feel connected.
Because they'd all believe they're from the same earth, the same city.
Right. It would create this shared purpose.
But it's still manipulating people, isn't it? Even if it's for what seems like a good reason, this noble lie is one of the most debated parts of the Republic. It makes you think about whether it's ever okay to, bend the truth, even for the sake of harmony. And then Socrates gets into how these guardians would live.
Communally, sharing resources, and even families.
It sounds pretty radical, giving up so much for the state.
That's Plato for you. Always pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible.
It makes you question what's really necessary for a just society.
And how we balance individual freedom with the needs of the community.
This is just the beginning of Socrates' exploration of the ideal city. We'll have to dive into that more later.
Definitely. There's still so much to unpack.
So we left off with this idea of the ideal city, with these selfless guardians all dedicated to the common good. It's pretty radical, right?
Yeah. But Socrates doesn't stop there. He actually outlines how even the most well-intentioned systems, they can still go wrong.
Yeah.
If justice and virtue aren't carefully maintained.
So it's like he's saying, even if you build the perfect city, it can still fall apart.
Right. He describes this kind of inevitable decline of governments, starting from the ideal, then aristocracy, and gradually descending into these less and less just forms.
It's almost like a slow-motion train wreck, like we were saying earlier, where the principles of justice just erode over time.
Exactly. And it all starts with this miscalculation, with the breeding of those elite guardians.
You mean like their kids aren't as qualified?
Right. They might not inherit all those ideal qualities that make their parents fit to rule. The wisdom, the intelligence, all that.
So even a small change, like a genetic hiccup, can have these huge consequences down the line.
Exactly. It can weaken the state over generations. And as these less qualified guardians, as they start to take over, they focus on what they know.
Just
physical strength, military power, those more tangible forms of power. It's less about wisdom and more about action.
It's a shift from valuing the mind to valuing the body, from wisdom to brute strength.
Yeah, and that's how you get democracy.
Yeah.
This society where military strength and victory become the most important things. Honor on the battlefield, that's the driving force.
It's like this warrior culture emerges.
Yeah.
But how does that then become oligarchy, which is all about wealth, right?
Well, think about it. Maintaining a strong military, it takes a lot of resources.
It's expensive.
Exactly. So those in power in a democracy, those who've gained status through their military success, they start to accumulate wealth.
As a way to keep their armies going and solidify their position.
Right. And gradually that love of honor, that thirst for glory, it gets replaced by a love of money.
It becomes more about personal gain than serving the state.
Exactly. And as wealth gets concentrated in the hands of a few, the gap between the rich and poor, it just widens.
And that creates tension.
Oh, absolutely. Socrates talks about how the rulers in an oligarchy, they become obsessed with getting more and more wealth.
They kind of forget about everyone else.
They neglect the true needs of the state and its people. He even compares them to drones.
Drones?
Yeah, like those lazy bees who just stuff themselves with honey while the worker bees do all the actual work.
Not a very flattering comparison.
Not at all. And if you remember Socrates' analogy of the well-ordered soul.
The one where each part has its role.
Right. In an oligarchy, that balance is completely gone. The desire for wealth, it overpowers everything else. Reason and virtue have no chance.
So it's not just the state that suffers under oligarchy, the people do too.
Absolutely. Their souls are corrupted by this constant need for more, more, more. And eventually, this corruption leads to oligarchy's downfall.
Because the people revolt.
Exactly. The gap between the rich and the poor gets so big, those who are marginalized, they eventually rise up.
And that's where democracy comes in.
Right. It's born out of the ashes of this failed oligarchy. It's like a pendulum swing from one extreme to the other.
From rule by the wealthy few to a system where everyone, at least in theory, has a say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Socrates, he's not exactly praising democracy.
He's not.
He sees it more as a necessary evil than a truly just form of government.
It seems like he's wary of any system where desires run wild, whether it's for honor, wealth, or even freedom itself.
That's a great point. He gets that democratic freedoms are appealing, but he's also worried about what happens when you take freedom too far.
When it becomes chaotic.
Right, when everyone's just doing their own thing with no sense of shared purpose or direction.
Like a ship where everyone wants to be the captain.
Exactly. Lots of motion, but no one actually steering the ship. And that's why Socrates thinks the democratic soul is especially vulnerable.
Vulnerable to what?
To the allure of tyranny.
So this is how he reached the bottom of the barrel, the worst form of government.
Tyranny is more than just a political system. It's a psychological state. The tyrant, as both a person and a ruler, represents the complete unraveling of the soul, when reason and virtue are completely gone, overtaken by desire.
It's like all those things we've been talking about, the love of wealth, the thirst for power, the hunger for pleasure, they all spiral out of control.
Exactly. And Socrates says these tyrannical impulses, they often start small, with these seemingly harmless indulgences.
Like what?
Like developing a taste for luxury, extravagant food, fancy clothes, things you don't really need.
So it's like a gateway drug to more destructive desires.
Exactly. What starts as a small vice can become a full-blown addiction to power and control. And as these desires grow stronger, they start to take over. They push aside reason, empathy, compassion, all of that.
So it's like this inner battle, this war within the soul.
Right, and that turmoil, it gets reflected in the tyrant's behavior. They become paranoid, suspicious, always thinking someone's out to get them.
And what's it like for the people living under a tyrant?
Socrates paints a pretty bleak picture. It's a climate of fear and repression, where freedom is crushed, and anyone who disagrees is silenced.
It's like that saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Exactly. The tyrant becomes a prisoner of their own paranoia and desires, surrounded by people who just tell them what they want to hear.
And if you remember the Ring of Gyges,
The shepherd who becomes invisible.
yeah, the tyrant is like, what happens when someone has unlimited power but zero moral compass? It makes you wonder, how do we prevent this? How do we create governments that give leaders power but also keep them in check?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's this delicate balance between freedom and order, between empowering leaders and holding them accountable. And the Republic doesn't give us all the answers.
But it does give us a way to think about these age-old questions.
Right. It's a reminder that building a just society isn't just about laws and institutions. It's about fostering virtue, wisdom, courage, all of that.
Both in individuals and in society as a whole.
Exactly. And maybe that's one of the biggest takeaways from the Republic.
It's not just about some utopian city. It's about each of us looking at our own lives.
Our own desires.
And asking ourselves, are we helping to create a more just world? Okay, so we've talked about this decline of governments, how a society that starts out all about wisdom can end up ruled by fear and, like, unchecked desires. Kind of a bummer, right?
Yeah, not exactly a happy ending. But remember, Glaucon and Adeimantus, they wanted Socrates to explain why living a just life is actually better. Even if, if the tyrant seems to have it all. The power, the wealth, the freedom to do whatever they want.
Yeah, because on the surface, it's pretty tempting to be that guy with the Ring of Gyges, getting away with all sorts of stuff. But Socrates is trying to show that justice isn't just about following rules or avoiding punishment.
Right. Right. He's saying it's about living a good life, a life that's true to yourself, to your deepest nature.
So how does he get there? How does he make that argument?
Well, he uses this analogy. He compares different parts of the soul to different kinds of people, each with their own main desire,
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of people?
So imagine you have a philosopher, someone who loves truth above everything else. Then you have a warrior, totally driven by honor and winning.
Yeah.
And then there's the businessman, focused on profit and all those material things.
So we've got the thinker, the fighter, and the moneymaker. I can see where this is going.
Each one represents a different part of the soul. The rational part, the spirited part, and the appetitive part.
Right. So the philosopher, that's like the part of us that wants to learn and understand things. The warrior, that's our desire for recognition, for achievement. And the businessman, well, that's just our craving for stuff, right?
Yeah, for comfort, for possessions. And Socrates asks, which of these people would actually have the best life, the most fulfilling one?
That's a tough question. Because all those things, knowledge, honor, wealth, They all have their appeal. They can all make you happy in some way.
True. But Socrates argues that only the philosopher, the one who lives truth, can really experience true happiness, the kind of happiness that lasts.
Why is that?
Because their happiness comes from something real, something that doesn't change. And here he brings back those forms we talked about before.
Oh, right, the forms, those perfect concepts like beauty and truth and justice, the ones that exist beyond the physical world.
Exactly. Socrates believed that true knowledge comes from the forms. They're the foundation of everything.
And because they're eternal, they never change. The happiness you get from understanding them, that's more stable too.
Right. More than the happiness you get from, say, buying a new car.
Yeah, that fades pretty quickly. So what you're saying is pursuing knowledge, it's not just some boring intellectual thing.
Right. It's a way to connect to something bigger than yourself.
To live a more meaningful life.
Exactly. Socrates says that by seeking truth, the philosopher creates this harmony in their soul, this balance. They're free from the worries and frustrations that everyone else has.
So it's like the philosopher is this self-sufficient gardener, tending to their own inner garden of wisdom, while the honor lover and the money lover, they're always dependent on something outside themselves.
Always chasing after something they can't ever really hold on to.
So they end up feeling empty, even if they have lots of achievements or money.
Yeah, like something's missing.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the tyrannical soul. The tyrant is like the worst of the both worlds.
But like a combo of the honor lover and the money lover?
Yeah. They crave power and control, which really just comes down to wanting recognition and wealth, but it's all amplified, taken to the extreme.
And those desires can never be satisfied, can they?
Nope. So the tyrant is stuck in this loop of always wanting more, never being content. They live in fear of losing what they have, always on the lookout for enemies.
Even if those enemies don't really exist.
Right. And Socrates says that this fear, this constant anxiety, it makes the tyrant miserable, even though, on the outside, they seem to have everything.
It's like they're trapped in this gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but completely alone.
And that's the real argument against injustice. It's not just that it hurts other people, it hurts you too. It twists you up inside, makes you disconnected from who you really are.
So living a just life, it's not about impressing anyone else or following rules just because. It's about finding that inner peace where your mind and your desires are working together.
It's about becoming the best possible version of yourself, whole and complete.
Yeah.
And, while the Republic doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide for how to do that,
it does give us some pretty good ideas.
It reminds us to use our reason, to seek knowledge and wisdom.
To figure out what's truly good and try to align our desires with that. It makes you think, what would Plato say about our world today? About our governments?
I'm sure he'd have a lot to say.
Could those philosopher kings he talks about, could they ever actually exist in a democracy?
That's a good question. One we might never know the answer to.
But one thing's for sure, it's up to all of us to keep thinking about justice, to question our assumptions, to try to build a better world.
Well said. And I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive into Plato's Republic.
It's a book that's still so relevant today, even though it was written, over 2,000 years ago?
It reminds us that justice is something we have to constantly work towards, both as individuals and as a society.
It's a journey. And like you said earlier, it might not always be easy, but it's definitely worth taking.